Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here today. Or I guess not see, but see at least 31 participants who are able to join us today. My name is Kate Wilson, and I'm the CEO of the Digital Impact Alliance. We are Think, Do, Replicate Tank, and a lot of what we do is work on some of the consistent, challenging barriers that are preventing digital development technology going to scale. One of the things that we've been working on for the last few years and really digging into with colleagues really across the digital ecosystem is what are some of the challenges that have been facing open source projects and the products that we're producing. These products are increasingly being used by governments, country governments, by NGOs, by implementers around the world. In fact, we were noting internally in our own team this week, even as bots were being used to write letters to congresspeople in the US about standing up around Ruth Bader Ginsburg's appointment to the Supreme Court Justice, that one of those products is actually reliant upon an open source tool that we are commonly all using today. So open source is here, it's real, it's in part of all of our work, and we all care about it deeply. Yet we recognize that many of these products aren't going to scale or fulfilling their full potential. So what we wanted to do today with our colleagues at the Open Source Center from Digital Square and from Village Reach, Open Lmis, is really share some of the stories of those digital public goods and some of the people who are working with them to bring them together and help take them to scale, and begin a conversation in which we could begin to talk about those issues. We also had hoped to have colleagues from the Digital Public Goods Alliance join us, but unfortunately they weren't able to make this time work in their schedules. But I really want to just thank all of you for joining in this discussion and invite you to continue the conversation over the next couple of weeks on our Open Source Center site, which we'll leave you information about in the chat. Thanks. So starting us off will be Heath Arensen. He is the open source director who focuses really on our business and sustainability. Heath will also be augmented by colleagues Brandon Bowersox-Johnson, who is the digital director for Village Reach Open Lmis. Brandon's really going to talk to us about what are some of the challenges and what does it look like if you're actually that product on the ground. And then finally, we'll ask Skye Gilbert, who has to join us just a touch late due to a conflicting panel, to talk about what Digital Square has been leading in terms of health innovation and really looking and digging into the business models and financing that we think need to change in order for digital public goods to really achieve their full potential. But Heath, could I turn it to you and have you walk us through just a couple of those questions, please?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So what does open source software have to do with international development, and why should we care about it? So digital tools focused on supporting social objectives are critical for accelerating the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they have been heavily invested in by donors for quite some time. Open source licensing is being widely embraced for its promise to create shared value by reducing duplication of effort, avoiding vendor lock-in, and a potentially lower total cost of ownership. The UN Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, released earlier this year, highlights the importance of open source products in development and calls for collaboration to support these digital public goods. We're going to use the term digital public goods to refer to these open source projects focused on the SDGs. First, let's take a look at the numbers. How many digital public goods are there? Well, there's different ways of counting it, and we're grateful that the Digital Public Goods Alliance has begun to develop some criteria to identify who's in and who's out for digital public goods. Having a high-level view of both the definition and how many there are will help us in supporting them. Right now, they have about 450 candidates in their pipeline, though most of these are in early stages of the development. At the Open Source Center, we actively work with about 30 projects, and we've identified about 130 more that we talk with on a regular basis. So how much are these investments worth? So we all care about this, and it's been a challenge to figure out, what is open source worth, and what is it worth investing in? What is it worth to the development community? So USAID this year developed a valuation framework based on looking at lines of code to determine the market replacement cost of digital public goods. And they looked at a number of sample DPGs. The first, OpenMRS, is a very well-established product. And based on this framework, they came out with a value of about $76 million. The value was created with just $5 million of direct spending, and it was augmented by the community of open source and code contributions. So a lot of value for investment. So if we extrapolate this out, we can see that the donor community investing $80 million in digital public goods could lead to $1 billion in value created. So open source, it has a lot of promise, but are we going to be able to get there? What are the challenges that come with decentralized open source? We've been investing this way for 10 years. Have we been successful? What changes can we make? Are we really kind of on the cusp of a revolution where open source powers the software that underlies the infrastructure that powers the SDGs forward? We'd like to think that we are very close, and we hope that this webinar will bring together a lot of voices and minds to work together towards that challenge. Despite the promise of open source, there are still major challenges facing existing digital public goods. According to the World Bank, only 13% of ICT projects in developing countries succeed. This is not just open source, but it highlights the challenges to digital development in general. There remains significant underfunding of projects, especially as they scale. Fragmentation is still far too common, and the decentralized nature of open source makes governance challenging. As with all of open source, the free rider challenge and unnecessary forking of code keep these projects from reaching their full potential. Further, and maybe most importantly, the audit and contracting requirements of donors requires more mature organizations to be able to accept and manage the funding, a requirement that most open source projects and small nonprofits are unable to meet without an organizational partnership. So who are the players that are involved in this open source ecosystem? The challenge with open source is that it's decentralized by design. That's its value. It belongs to nobody. But what is the challenge when something belongs to nobody? Who does the work? Who's responsible? Who's on the hook if something goes wrong? Who's going to support it? So open source can really only thrive if we figure out how to bring all these different stakeholders and community members together in very strong community governance. So who are these players? So we've broken it down in four main categories. The first is maintainers, those who steward the central vision for the project and take a lead on governance. The second are contributors, those who volunteer time and resources to the project. Third are the sustainers, those who provide financial support. And finally, the consumers, those who use and build value on top of the software. How do we bring this all together? What is the glue that brings it together? So when we started the Open Source Center, we had a number of assumptions. One of those is that it would be important for some type of a coordinating body to play a catalyzing role in governance for these projects. And we're excited that a number of organizations, not just ourselves, are now involved in supporting digital public goods. Including Digital Square, who's able to join us today, and the Digital Public Goods Alliance, who we're working with very, very closely and are very excited about the potential that's going to come over the next year as the Alliance rolls out. So digital public goods need support as they scale through various phases. It starts at the design phase, the idea phase. The principles for digital development, which are stewarded here at Dial, are a great starting point in the design phase of a project because they help you really think through the entire life cycle and how you move through the various phases. Next is the innovation phase. So I used to work in the innovation phase. It's a lot of fun. The reason it's a lot of fun is you get to experiment, you get money without accountability because you're meant to fail. And so you get to try new things, you get to use words like blockchain and AI, and you get to build and fail. What we found is the real challenge is moving from innovation to growth. And that's where our focus really is. There is a major blockage when we move from something that we think is proven as we begin to scale it. And what we found is that most open source projects will go through some fairly major changes as they move into the growth and the mature phase. And so we're just going to be honest with that and say, like, this is something that these projects actually need. Most of them will have to rebuild their solution at least once. They're probably going to change their primary organizational home, and they're going to need to identify new sources of revenue along the way. So we want to take a look at the journey of one digital public good, because as we've looked at a lot of them, their stories are remarkably similar. And that similarity starts in their founding. While most open source is started with a technical need in mind, and it's technology for technology, what makes the digital public good stand apart is that at the very core is a social objective. This tool is being built to meet some social objective, to meet the sustainable development goals. And so Open Lmis is an example of success. They are a story of doing things right, but they're also a story of the persistent challenges on the long path to financial sustainability. Open Lmis's first success was in their founding. They noticed that they were building a supply chain management solution, which is important in humanitarian context, and several other organizations were doing the same. And rather than each kind of building on their own, they were able to create a consortium and build it together. So Rockefeller, USAID, and Gates took on a role as founding supporting funders. Village Reach, an NGO, took on the founding stewardship role and provided a legal entity that would allow the project to be able to accept funds, hold intellectual property, manage their community, and facilitate software development. Now, it might seem strange, but it's very common that many digital public goods are started within NGOs, nonprofits, and universities. And the primary reason for this is the tie to the social objective with which they start, and because these are the institutions that are able to take and accept donor funds. As the project began to grow, it was shared under an open source license. Community partners came alongside. ThoughtWorks, JSI, Chemonics, Chai, and Path were building value on top of the platform and making up the community. Along the way, as is common, based on early user feedback, the product was re-architected and widely deployed. It's now in 11,000 health facilities throughout Africa. Open Lmis's second success is with their scale. They were able to build a high quality product, bring together a lot of partners, and deploy it at scale. So it's a success. But what happens next? As you can see in this graph, we've identified this area we're calling the Valley of Death, which is very common for digital public goods. When the initial funding, especially grant funding, begins to run out before a replacement revenue source, ideally a market-driven revenue source, can replace the costs, these projects just flounder. And Open Lmis, despite its success, finds themselves in this valley of death. They're currently going through a sustainability study and finding various methods that they can use for long-term financial sustainability. So most projects struggle in the same way. It comes back to how they are founded. Oftentimes when you're started with grant funding, you don't think about alternative revenue sources, especially market-driven private sector approaches, until much further along in the project. But there are many sources for long-term financial sustainability. They could include long-term grant commitments, but also membership models, commercial partnerships, and user-generated revenue should all be thought through as the project reaches scale. Based on our work at the Open Source Center, we've worked with about 30 digital public goods, kind of going fairly deep into their struggles. We provided consulting services, small grants, and in that we've learned that there's really kind of 5 things that we need, and these are the things that we recommend most projects kind of think about as they move out of that innovation phase or a floundering, maturing phase to really be able to reach scale. The first is to identify a legal fiscal home. There needs to be some legal entity or entities identified that can hold the intellectual property, execute legal contracts, and pay staff. Second, an organization or individual must take on the primary role of maintaining the project. This is the one that's a little bit harder to understand, but it's holding the vision. It's that organization or person who, if they disappeared, the project just might disappear. Somebody has to hold that vision to keep the community together, to manage the roadmap. The third is a dedicated product team. What we found, and it's fairly obvious, that if you have consistent volunteer or paid resources on the project, you're going to do much better at maintaining quality and reducing the total cost of supporting the product. If you're consistently having to use external contractors, jumping between organizations and teams, it becomes much more difficult. So we put this as core. The fourth is access to core funding. There must be some reliable source of funds to ensure the ongoing support of the product. If you can't do that, it's going to be very difficult to scale, because organizations that would choose this product and build value on top of it are not going to take that risk if they fear that they won't be supported. And lastly, a connection to a community of practice, learning from each other, collaborating together, and reducing duplication. Open source tools for international development hold a lot of promise. And we believe that with further investment and support, we can see a future where digital public goods underpin our shared digital infrastructure and accelerate us towards the sustainable development goals. So how do we get there? How do we get from where we are to where we want to go? That's what the panel is going to dig a little bit deeper into. So I'm going to hand it back over to Kate to lead the panel.
Thanks so much, Heath. I really appreciate you sharing with everybody some of the main challenges and insights that we've seen. So really, if I just kind of quickly to summarize, you're essentially saying that, you know, the challenge with open source, or I shouldn't say the challenge with open source is real and it's here. We've counted over 400 projects that are already actively being used to support countries around the world. In some cases, such as in the case of USAID's study, $76 million per project. Now that's a pretty big and extensive investment, but there's many more who are bigger and there are many who are smaller. Major challenge is that very few are actually succeeding. And we're with 13% only succeeding for a variety of reasons, not just open source. At that kind of cost, we're spending a lot of resources without perhaps receiving some of the benefit of a lot of those resources. And that there are some core functions that we really need to all put in place and work on actively together in order to make sure that each of these products, the ones that actually can sustain and scale and successfully transfer over into that growth and maturity phase, that they actually can be instilled. I wanted to turn over to Brandon to actually help us walk through and sort of add to, if you could, Brandon, some of the areas that you have seen in terms of Open Lmis, and really kind of comment on some of the things that Heath has actually added in that's talk about the Open Lmis journey. Like, what does this really look like as a project on the ground? I worked with Open Lmis in its infancy days in 2007 and 2008 on common requirements. We saw it transitioning to a number of people, but I think it's so powerful to hear the story of one specific product. Because at least what we have seen, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, those challenges are not specific to the product or what it physically does, but what he's really painting a picture of is a common set of challenges that we're all struggling with.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, that's excellent. And it's great to see so many people here and to get to talk about this, because I think Open Lmis is definitely not alone in these challenges. So to make it specific and yet tell our story, almost 10 years ago, we recognized, along with many other NGOs, the need for software for supply chain, and in our case, making sure medicines could get to those last mile clinics, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And other people were doing the same thing, so we pulled together to create this open source tool, and that was a success. Just getting a number of different NGOs and organizations to all use the same tool to help implement their projects. We could do more together than we could do alone. So that was an important step, but what does that really look like, and where do those challenges of fragmentation come in? Well, in the intervening years, you end up with different NGOs or different groups getting project-based funding to maybe implement the tool in one country, another group getting different funding to implement the tool in another country with different goals and needs, and a third or fourth, and all of a sudden, without any core product roadmap, that core maintainer role that Heath described, it's really easy for the project to just have different people involved in different versions, but not one clear roadmap and not one clear version of the software that is moving forward in a unified direction with voices from everybody, but as a coherent team. So that fragmentation is a real challenge. And so I work at Village Reach, one NGO that has been kind of stewarding OpenLMIS to try to create that core team and consistency and really build a community and the governance, which are some of those tough challenges to get the different countries and different projects talking together, sharing what they do so that truly some investment or improvement in one country can benefit the rest of the community and that we can be sharing the code. But it does take, in the software world, some core maintainers and some place to hold the intellectual property and hold the roadmap and some of those key functions that Keith mentioned.
So both of you kind of touched on, and this is something I know Sky Gilbert really wants to comment on as well, but we'll come back to it. But both of you have mentioned the critical nature of, and one of Lawrence, thank you for your question, talked about sort of sustainability in terms of not just self-funding or in building and putting in place a real business model. And I was hopeful that you could elaborate on that a little bit, Brandon, and sort of, what are the steps that OpenLMIS has taken in that regard? What's been easy about that? What's been hard? And then Heath, if you could also direct some comments and really elaborate for the group a little bit on like, what are some of those challenges? You touched on it in your presentation, but you didn't quite go into depth on kind of how that actually works.
Great. Yeah, for OpenLMIS, so I think being open source did solve that problem of multiple organizations kind of reinventing the wheel and doing the same thing. At least by pooling our resources and creating an open source tool, we could share that across this multi-stakeholder community. And so that part was great. But you're right, Kate, the business models and the kind of revenue models don't automatically flow from that. And open source business models are complicated and are not what an average NGO like Village Reach or other NGOs are prone to do. It's just not in our nature, especially when we're focused on taking grant funding, doing a program in a country to have impact on the SDGs like health, where Village Reach's focus is. It's not in our nature to be thinking at the start that we should be structuring our open source project to really have a revenue or membership or subscription model or any of those kinds of business structures Heath mentioned. And so OpenLMIS has on this journey learned that we really need to proactively do some sustainability planning to think, how can this pivot from being totally a donor philanthropic investment to being a project that's sustainable after we're all gone in the kind of donor and aid funded sector, and a project that can live on with revenue models and a structure that works. So we have done a few different things, evaluated where could the software actually have other paying customers outside of just the donor supported kind of public health mechanism in lower middle income countries, but where are there actually people who would pay for this software because we've built something of value. And what other markets and other channels, perhaps even outside of health and in other government functions, could this software also apply to? Secondly, switching the model so that we remain open source, but have an enterprise support or kind of like an annual membership fee so that people who pay in know they can count on this software being robust, getting security updates, similar to Red Hat Linux, where it's like, well, if you buy the enterprise version, you can count on a trusted level of service, trusted security updates. You pay something for that, but you kind of know the product is there and you can count on it in return. And also we've done work looking at private sector partnerships. What other organizations who are selling, in our case, like supply chain software, could our product actually fit with and complement? So maybe the future state, as we're going through our sustainability work currently, maybe the future state a few years from now is that there's an open source core, but even a paid subscription version, or that countries could graduate to a commercial offering with more advanced kind of paid features, but the basic version of supply chain for health, for low and middle income public health systems could always be kind of a free open source core. So there are many different models for that. And it's really important work. And many of the digital public goods face these same questions of, we were starting from a donor mindset and kind of donor one country at a time project funding, but how do we shift gears out of that fragmented state and actually ask these bigger questions about shifting to the business models that are proven to work in open source, thinking about revenue structures, business models, markets, and customers, which is just a different kind of hat to wear and a different kind of thought and questions to work on than we started with. So this is a really important journey.
Thank you so much for that. I say it's so heartening to me because when I started in the nonprofit space after having come out of commercial software, where business models were everything. In fact, that was my job. It was quite a surprise to see that we were starting from the other direction, I have to say. And I do think that that journey has been taken quite a bit. Heath, I wanted to, before I turn to a couple of the questions that are popping up, because there's some great questions in the chat, and I have a few more, but I wanted to ask you to sort of comment on some of the things that Brandon said. Are you seeing the shift to sort of a stronger business model and community focus from the work that you've been doing through the Open Source Center? Do you think it's time to really change that mindset really as we invest in new open source projects or digital public goods? And even provocatively, is it time to maybe have a little bit less open source goods?
All right. Yeah, there's a number of things there, and open source has a lot of promise, and I think the biggest promise is that ability to have shared value, that we invest in a common product. So rather than everybody kind of building their own for themselves or trying to sell it, we build it together, and that's kind of like a core premise at the core. One of the challenges that we have with open source, and let's look at Open Lmis again, is that you've got the core open source product, which is free. Anybody can pick it up and build value on top of it. I worked in startups and came from the commercial side before this. And if I ever saw a piece of software that came to me and said, we've got a startup, but you're not going to start from scratch. We've already invested, $20 million to build it, and we already have a market. You have, 10,000 customers already, and that's your starting point. You're not starting from zero. You're starting from that. I would say, wow, that's great. Give me that startup, because I don't have to do all those first investments, etc. So why isn't that happening? It really is the nature of kind of like ownership of the core product of open source, that shared value. Who does the business model? Who makes the revenue? Who gets to pocket any revenue that comes in? And what you would see in kind of open source is there's kind of generally two ways that it goes. One is what we call like a single trusted vendor. There might be one organization, and that organization might do consulting services, have a software service version on top of the software, sell support, do events, a whole bunch of things that this one organization can do. And through that, they can generate enough revenue to support the core, etc. So that's kind of the trusted vendor. The second is community open source, where there's a whole community of, say, 20 or 30, commercial vendors who are building different types of value on the same common core. The challenge that happens there is that because it's free, anybody can kind of pick it up and run with it. And that's where we talk about the free rider problem. How do, let's say, like in the case of, Open Lmis, which will probably cost about $500,000 every year to kind of maintain it. And that could come through code contributions, but that's kind of a good starting number. Where's that money going to come from? So let's imagine that it's community open source, which it is. Multiple vendors come and build million-dollar businesses on top of that. How do we get that money to come back to support the core, right? So there are methods of this, membership models, etc. I think those are starting to be used, but it is challenging. So what we think is kind of important at the core is having an organization that can steward that core project, that can steward the community, keep them to be good citizens, to have them contributing back. And most importantly, is something I don't think we've fully figured out, is how to have a flow of money coming back from the commercial partners who are building value on top of that commonly shared asset. I think that's something that we want to work towards doing better at.
Thanks so much for that. I think that's really helpful. So both starting from the business model, but then sort of what are the differences and the challenges different types of models of open source, and then really on some of the implementation challenges. I want to turn to one of the questions in the chat. I'm sort of going to paraphrase this a little bit from Ed, and also welcome our colleague Sky Gilbert, who is in our back-to-back panels today. She is joining us just a little bit late, but welcome, Sky. Sky is the Executive Director of Digital Square, which is housed in a global health organization called PATH, and underneath Digital Square's mandate, they really are working with a number of the open source products, as well as supporting governments around the world and their digital health implementation journey. And so she also lives this up close and personal, but also works quite frequently with Open LMIS. So I'm going to paraphrase this question from Ed and then ask any of you to jump in. But Sky, I know that this is a subject that's particularly dear to your heart, right? So many of the governments we see struggling with the concept of open source, particularly even thinking about the procurement of foundational e-governance systems. And I really think about that as digital ID, wallets, data privacy and security, making sure that you have core messaging systems in place, many others, what we at Dial call like the foundational building blocks of a whole of society approach. And one of the things is seeing, and then the question is really like, what do we need to do from a communication and advocacy perspective to kind of communicate, to demystify open source and get governments excited about the digital public goods. And really some of that is tying into the procurement and the financing of it. So you have to first, have public will and political will that this is actually the right way to go, and then you need the right financing and procurement system. So I was wondering, Sky, could you kind of unpack that and some of the challenges or opportunities that you're seeing actually in people that you work with and in countries that you're working with around the world and rolling out open source products?
Thanks, Kate. This is a topic of great passion, and I'm happy to unpack. So I'd actually like to open with just a story or a recent experience that we had in Tanzania, where we ran a digital health procurement to support the government in implementing a health information mediator. On the review panel was a donor as well as the government. And when we ran this procurement, the government engaged and designed the RFA process. They engaged in a technical review, which was not just reviewing a document, but actually there were live demos and Q&As, and then ultimately arrived at a different conclusion with the donor and ended up using technical rationale to out-negotiate the donor and get the donor to agree with what the government wanted for their eventual vendor. And their eventual vendor was one of our open source global goods. And I think that for me, there were a couple of ingredients that were essential to making it work in this way. One is that the government of Tanzania has had a fair amount of partnership with PATH, my host institution, for a number of years in capacity strengthening. So a number of members of their governing body have gone through TOGAF certification, COBIT certification, have been working in the trenches of thinking about their digital strategy. And so they brought all of that knowledge and information to the procurement process and to the requirement setting and the RFA and the evaluation. I think the other thing that was really essential is that they were not just checking off the technical side of the digital strategy and the implementation roadmap and looking at the procurement just on that side. They were also on the operational side. They had partnership in setting the budget for the roadmap and doing the costing side. And so they had an understanding of the business side of open source software that could then inform their evaluation of the RFA. And I think that both aspects of knowledge are really, really important in informing the selection of products and helping health leaders make decisions about digital. And often we neglect one or the other or both. And so I think all of that was really essential. And then I think the final piece on procurement, or the complexities around procurement, is that there's often this idea that digital procurements are just like any other procurements. And I work in health, and I think there's a lot of myth busting to be done that the cost structures for developing software, particularly open software, do not resemble the cost structures and the way One thinks about procuring medical devices or drugs or vaccines. And so running a digital procurement through a medical procurement process, which might be the default in the health sector, doesn't work. And I think also there's a lot of myth busting to do around the underlying cost structures for software development so that there's better understanding across all stakeholders, which will build trust and ultimately bring different stakeholders in as partners to help problem solve the ongoing financing needs.
Wow, a lot there, and a great story. Actually, now I'm dying to know what they picked. But one of the things so what I really heard you sort of highlight, and just to see if I recap this well, is that you really had an experience where you had the country, which I love, and a lot of work, great work that Path, and full disclosure, I used to work at Path, but they, has done really in helping arm country level decision makers to really make empowered choices. Two, there was a clear process that was set up. People understood the trade-offs that they were making between multiple different solutions, and that those solutions were being judged on, a number of variables in terms of cost, its ability to implement it, how it could be maintained over time, how it worked with other things. So really driving towards interoperable back-end systems, and that the procurement process was pretty transparent along the way. So it sounds like a great model for a lot of us to learn, and sort of also help advocate for and build upon of kind of how to do that. I'm curious, as you all think about that and put that in that context for that sort of universal type of understanding to take place, is that one of the main challenges that these projects really face? Is, people don't necessarily understand, the process may be unclear, the procurements may be struggling, far more than the products, because that's what I hear you all kind of talking to. You're not talking a lot about like, what are the challenges with the products being suitable?
Yeah.
Have we moved on from that conversation about is open source or are these products suitable for large scale? Are we really at like all the institutional ecosystem issues?
I think, I'll jump in. I think so, at least for my, seat, especially seeing the Open LMIS's journey and at Village Reach in the health sector, there are a lot of products of big names like Open MRS, right? The medical record system that are like widely used, successful. The product clearly fills a niche, meets a need. And Heath, you had showed a lot of logos on an earlier slide. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of products that fill a need that the market just wasn't filling, either because of price or the features from commercial tools don't work in the offline environments or aren't adaptable in the way that countries, at least the countries we work in sub-Saharan Africa, need. And so these open source tools have rushed in and I think really filled a need. And I think, Kate, you're right that product is where many of these tools are strong. But those ecosystem issues around how are things financed, what are the business models and revenue structures, how does procurement for the tools work, how does governance work for these digital tools, those are the tricky areas that need the ecosystem players to collaborate and really help solve, because the products themselves are helping make an impact on the SDGs, but we've got to change the structure so that they can live on and continue to be used outside of just health. It continue to be used across sectors to really get at more and more of the SDGs and be fundamental building blocks that countries can trust.
So really a cross-sectoral approach. And I'm going to ask you, Brandon, I'm going to put you on the spot because one of the great questions that came in through chat is, how do you think the SDGs, one of the questions was, do the SDGs measure the impact of open source? I can tell you, I know that they don't, but how would you think about that impact measure being added into the SDGs, or how we're talking about the SDGs? Any thoughts?
That's a great question. I guess the part of that I would respond to is, I do think that the cross-sectoral approach, even though it takes time, is really important. That governments ultimately, some of those key systems like civil registration, citizens being able to have a private, ID so that their healthcare records can all be connected, but also so that education records or digital payments or things way outside of health, those building blocks across across government are really key, and that takes even more time and governance to build that sort of collaboration and cross-sectoral tools. But there's a huge need, and when you look at the SDGs, they aren't all just individual silos.
Yeah, so maybe reusability is one of those key metrics we might want to start to consider. So I wanted to ask any of you to do this because I want to pull some of the great questions from the chat. This is from Sircon. In economics, public goods are usually sustained through taxes. Have you all seen or talked to anyone about plans for similar models in terms of digital public goods?
I think it's a really great question, and that is a typical way of doing it. I think that the closest benchmark case that I can think of is the Gavi model, where it's not a straight taxation to taxpayers, but basically every dose of vaccine, there is a proportion of that is paid by domestic tax revenues from countries. And then there's a proportion that's covered from philanthropic donors. And for a lot of those folks, when Gavi was established, that was money that was taxed from governments, right? They felt it from a budgetary perspective. They had to shift budget to fund Gavi. And then also from a USAID perspective and from other donors, they had to take budget away from their cost centers and move it into Gavi. So I think that in that sense, that is a form of taxation that got you there. I think that what is interesting in digital health is it's unclear what if you were to go in that direction, what would be the right taxation model? How much is from domestic tax revenues? How much from philanthropic sources? Given some digital touches direct to consumer, is there an out-of-pocket portion? And I think that this is a really big question for the community: is what is the sustainable solution? What is the equitable solution for taxation?
Right. Heath, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that there's the additional complexity and maybe even opportunity that this is international and not national, right? So if you have a national, public good, you tax your citizens and you give. We're talking, beyond borders. What does it look like to support, products that are shared across governments? And I do think in kind of gov tech, there is an open source movement for government saying, how can we share our investments across government? That's a nice trend. But I do think that the international donor community should actually, begin to think. I think when you say a public good, you say, does it make sense for there to be some, revenue replacement? Should I charge somebody to come into my park? Maybe yes, maybe no. But there becomes a point on certain public goods where you say there's not really a good market model available that will help us maintain the social good that this product is producing. And I do think that there is probably a place for the long-term, donor support of certain products or parts of them in order to have them kind of compete against, let's say, big tech or other kind of commercial vendors. To me, I have a vision of where we can kind of, lift up, open source by building really kind of strong institutions around it that will allow it to really be able to kind of, compete on an even playing field. And then by doing that, get all the values of a shared common good.
Okay. I want to come back to some of the questions that we had originally posed in this panel and talk to you all about, what are some of the challenges that existing institutions are having really moving these projects from the innovation phases to sort of growth and maturity. And I want to address one of the questions that James posed actually in the chat, which was, what does it look like to have a contribution model for commercial parties, and are there incentives for donors to adopt OSS thinking? I just want to let you know, James, most donors actually, almost every major donor in the world, we currently have 234 signatories to the Principles for Digital Development. Principles for Digital Development does emphasize the use of open source software, and 5 donors actually have incorporated the digital principles into their procurement guidelines. So actually the bias is largely towards the use of open source software, but as you know, sky's Skye's discussion sort of illuminated, sometimes from a government perspective, that may not seem like the choice, may or may not. I wasn't clear whether or not the product was proprietary or not. But honestly, even as other companies have stated, Microsoft, Google, many others in panels over the last week, a significant portion of all of their code is actually open source, or they're committed to making most of it open source in terms of this. So it's sort of a blurred line, and I think that goes to one of the earlier questions about understanding of what does it mean to be open source, what does it mean to have open standards, and I think that there's a lot more unpacking to do and education around that across all parts of the digital development ecosystem. But coming back to this question of, are these existing institutions equipped? What is it that they lack? Is it just that education? Is it something else? Heath, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that I think these projects will need. I think identifying really kind of at the core who has kind of ownership, responsibility, etc. Figuring out who can go and enter into a contract. If there's an open bid or open RFP, who can kind of go in and do that. I do think that most open source projects, if they are completely kind of standalone at the core, will really have a challenge in being able to do that. So what are the organizations that can come alongside them to be able to help them up their game and be able to enter into contracts, etc. I think that there isn't something that's kind of there and available right now. You can look and see what a lot of these projects are doing, right? So a lot of times they're starting their own 501c3, and they have big dreams that they're going to really kind of grow. We talked about OpenMRS. They've started their own 501c3. But it has very few employees. It wasn't able to really kind of reach that scale. A number of organizations have done that and have had challenges. So we think that having a number of these projects kind of come together can help us reach economies of scale. And so, yeah, to answer the question, I don't think that the current institutions are well equipped to really kind of hit this vision that we have for digital public goods.
Skye, I'm going to turn to you. What do you think are some of those barriers, though, around the institutions being able to do this? Is it different than being a product, or is it different than what Brendan painted earlier, or is it something unique and different? Because it's not just about supporting one product, it's about bringing together many products.
Yeah.
What's different about that, particularly from the vantage point of Digital Square? Because you guys are trying to do this every day.
I think that what is different or interesting, I think that first of all, I want to acknowledge that we're not in the same place we were 2 or 3 years ago. The 200 plus signatories you have in the principles for donor alignment that was launched in 2018, that's a huge move, because prior to that, I'm not sure we had technical alignment among technical leaders within funding agencies and within a lot of the partners. And moving to a place where you generally have alignment on principles is a huge step. What has been a painful learning for us and has caused us to really invest a lot in procurement and understanding the operational side is that we have learned that getting alignment technically on what needs to be done doesn't translate into just operational, let's go do it. There's a lot of operational complexity. I think Brandon highlighted some really articulately, as did Heath. The only thing I would add, Kate, to your point about coordinating multiple products is that if you're already having to navigate between the different requirements and rules and regulations about many different funders, if you do that on intake and then on pushing out funds, you're having to coordinate across many, many, many different products that might have different governing structures, but you're trying to get them all to be interoperable and aligned to a common set of standards. Suddenly your cost to coordinate both among the many different funding structures and the operational requirements they have and then out becomes very high. And so I think that is another piece that makes it quite complicated to figure out, in a place where we haven't quite solved the financing challenges with open source. We've set a vision for the community that does have some coordination costs that can come down over time, but currently is high.
Brendan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say the way I see the current ecosystem system. We're making progress on the journey. It's been great from our perspective at Village Reach and helping steward Open LMIS. Great to be able to work with Dial and the Open Source Center, who've helped for the last few years us think through the open source business models and sustainable offerings. And for Digital Square, who's been a key partner of ours, helping not just as a funder, but really pushing the ecosystem towards standards and interoperability among many of those global goods that you showed on the earlier slide. So there are key building blocks there, along with the Digital Public Goods Alliance getting started, kicked off at UNICEF. And so I think the ecosystem is starting to have some supporting mechanisms that have been really helpful for us and many of the others. But I think the missing piece is, and maybe this gets towards question 4 on the screen, there still is a need for NGOs like us who aren't set up to sort of be the legal home for a piece of software, or to have the central maintainer and software team and set the product roadmap and a lot of the roles that Heath mapped out on that slide. We're not, as NGOs, always set up to do all of those jobs well. And every one of these digital public goods faces those same questions. And so if there were a kind of software foundation that could offer more of those services in a shared way, I feel like many of us digital public goods could collectively, turn for some of these shared services and solve those problems together as a team, help our tools to work together and interoperate and actually meet market needs, on a collective basis, and help to create revenue and business models fitting some of those building blocks together collectively. I think so many of us face the same problems, and doing things like setting up our own 501c3s and our own foundations, one-off to solve them may work for a few of the big players who have the time, or even the open LMISs who have kind of years of us kind of pushing on stewardship. But for many of those digital public goods, they don't have just the funding time or team to do that. And so giving a home like a foundation where collectively we could all go on this journey to take it to the next step, past Sky where we've gotten the ecosystem to today, would seem to me to be a really strong offering that could help a lot of us.
So a really great, I agree with Ed's comment on there, a really great vision laying out how we all face common challenges in supporting open source. There's a number of common services and talents and skills, community, business, figuring out the legal and IP, and helping take them to scale that are not actually competitive differentiators of the product, and still allows a thriving ecosystem, but can share services together. I would also add into that list testing and interoperability and making different systems work together. So I think that's an amazing vision, and one which I really love, Brendan. I was curious, Sky, in your, I'm going to twist number 4, but also just to add on to what Brandon's comments are, what's your vision for where we are in 5 years in terms of, supporting open source in a different way? So we talked about how far we've come. Like, where do we need to go next? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So for me, I think that COVID has highlighted the role of digital in health systems, and will continue to do so in new ways over the coming months. And there's going to be a moment where people realize, in order to equitably deliver care in the context of a pandemic and building resilience, you're really going to need digital tools to support those services. And I'm just speaking in the context of health because that's what I know. But I think that could catalyze a much broader movement towards closing the digital divide and equitably delivering a broad range of services to people, to citizens throughout the world. And as we do that, I think that there's a note in chat around, I think James is saying there's a lot more work to be done. And I think what James is highlighting here around procurement norms, commercial engagement, mixed models, those are all things that we need to confront in the coming 5 years. And my vision would be that actually, the crises we're in right now catalyze a broader recognition of just how important it is to bridge the digital divide, and that some very key market analytics that we publish and promote and share in the coming year can help build a common understanding of what what needs to be done when it comes to procurement and engagement, and what financing models we need to adopt in order to deliver that to everyone. So I think next step immediate is closing information asymmetries and building a common understanding of what's at stake and what we need to resolve. And then from there, solving, I think, what is now very much an operational challenge and a financing challenge.
Thanks. Heath, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, so the question is, there are existing foundations for open source software. Are those good enough? And we would say for a lot of things they are. They can hold intellectual property, they can help manage the community, etc. But what we think I think the vision of digital public goods is much bigger than just open source software. I think that it's having high quality products that governments and major institutions can rely on, that can deliver, the quality and shared value at a great cost. So to be able to do that, we do need to figure out the financing problem. How do we move money? I think Digital Square is on the right track with that. We have to figure out, how do we support these products from a point of view of people? Create support mechanisms, training mechanisms. We need to know, how do we enter into contracts with commercial partners, with governments? So all of these things, are not what a typical open source product is kind of ready and able to kind of, do through their volunteer distributed community. But they're a very important core. So I have a vision where we can build some of these other, value added services that are kind of necessary to bring these digital public goods up onto an even playing field.
Great. Thank you all so much for sharing your time, your thoughts today, and particularly for our audience. We're deeply grateful for you joining us. And as Michael, our colleague Michael Downey has noted in the notes, this is the beginning of this discussion, certainly not the end. And we invite you to join us and all of our colleagues who couldn't be here today. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are. Thanks, and take care.